So far in the Biel Grandmaster tournament, we've seen a tremendous fighting spirit, and that continued into round 3. And the game I'd like to look at from that round is Magnus Carlsen, world champion, against 8-time Russian champion Peter Svidler. Carlsen opened with e4. Now, Svidler played e5 against Vacher Le Grave in round 1, but today he played a Sicilian, and he went in for the Najdorf variation. So he's definitely up for a fight here. Now, in this position, Magnus has played a whole range of moves, h3, g3, even some more outlandish stuff as well. But today, he played bishop g5, the most theoretical move, the sharpest move. And Magnus just has a knack of playing opening variations that he knows his opponent will find extremely uncomfortable, and he definitely hit the mark with this move. As soon as this came on the board, you could see from Peter's body language that he felt really uncomfortable. And in fact, Svidler admitted after the game that this was the move that made him basically drop the Najdorf for some time. And clearly he didn't expect Magnus to play this move today. But he showed that he was also up for a fight. Now e6 is the main line here, and one can play this in a fairly solid way, but no. Peter played knight d7, which is currently very trendy, but extremely double-edged because it gives white the chance to get an early attack. Game continued like this, h6. Magnus dropped the bishop back, and f4. Now the main move here is e5, and after this exchange, then castle's queenside. If that knight is taken, then e5 is absolutely deadly. So generally in that position, black plays queen c7 and so on. It's a really rich struggle. But instead of that, Svidler played queen c7. It's a slightly unusual move, obviously to prevent white pushing forward with e5. Now there are various ways for white to play the position. Knight f3, even taking on f6 and e5, but well, Magnus played somehow the most straightforward move, castle's queenside. Bishop g7, and now one could play f5 here. That's possible, even go back to this move knight f3, but g4 played by Magnus. Again, a very straightforward move, so that if black were to castle here, well, you could play f5, you could simply start opening things up on the king side with g5. So Svidler played e5. This was taken. Now one could recapture with the pawn and the knight would drop back. Of course, I mean, there are pros and cons to this move, but you know, white can try to sink a knight in on d5 at some moment anyway. But knight takes. Very often this knight is such a beautiful piece on e5, and this is a rock in the middle of the board which may well hold black's position together. Now, I was commentating live on this game here in Biel with my co-commentator Anna Rudolph, and suddenly we noticed from social media on Twitter, lots of people were suggesting knight f5 here. There was a whole clamour, and indeed when I checked this later with Chess Engine, then this is a strong choice by Chess Engines. Extraordinary, one can sacrifice this knight at such an early stage in the game and simply have positional compensation. So the idea is that white just wants to play the rook to g1 to attack that bishop, undermining the support for the knight. If the knight were to drop back, say to d7, then that means that white could go in with knight d5. It's actually incredibly dangerous for black, this position. It's very hard to consolidate. So for example, rook f8 making room for the bishop on h8, but then simply queen e3, ready to take the pawn on h6, and again attacking the knight on f6. It rather reminds me of a variation that the Hungarian international master Biel championed in a slightly different variation, but he also sacrificed a knight on f5, getting this pawn on f5, which gives white a lot of space and prevents black's bishop coming out from c8. So knight f5, very interesting idea, but Magnus played h3 to support the pawn on g4. And he found another very aggressive idea. First of all, he played queen f2, attacking the knight on f6. The knight dropped to d7. And here, at the time during the game, I was anticipating rook g1, and I still really like that move actually. And it's kind of waiting for black to do something and teeing up for knight f5. So for example, rook c8, knight f5, I still want to play this move, and the rook is perfectly placed on g1 opposite the bishop. And I think rook g1, to my eyes, looks very promising. But Magnus played another move which looks extremely promising. Well, what a shocker. The bishop came out to b5. Now, we have seen this motif in other variations of the knight off. There's a famous Gothenburg variation in another bishop g5 main line where this works. So first of all, what happens if pawn takes bishop? Then we take the bishop on e6, take on b5, and next move knight d6, and that's rather uncomfortable for black's king. So it's clear that can't be taken. So castle's kingside. Now the follow-up, well, eliminating this knight. Now, however black takes involves some kind of compromise. So for example, knight takes allows bishop e7, and the pawn on d6 drops. Or bishop takes d7 allows that knight into d5, extremely powerful. As usual in the Najdorf, d5 and f5 absolutely key squares. If the knights get in there, it's extremely dangerous. So queen takes. And now, well, I was thinking just bishop f6 here and exchanging on g7. So nice to eliminate that dangerous bishop on the long diagonal, and also white can try and attack this pawn, this isolated pawn. I thought queen g3 guards against a rook's an exchange sacrifice, tees up for knight f5. It seems to me that white has a positional advantage here. It's a pleasant position. But Magnus had intended something completely different. He just went for it with knight f5. I mean, he's really playing ambitiously here. Now that has to be captured. Pawn takes, threatening the bishop, and of course the main idea, opening up the g-file. And Peter hurried to move his move his king away with king h7. Rook g1 anyway. Now, question, what happens if the bishop moves away? Well, a couple of continuations. One can actually take the bishop on g7, but eventually we thought that probably just b3 is a decent move here, looking to just take that bishop, and if it moves away, that looks very fishy when a knight can move into d5. So quite quickly Peter dropped the bishop back to h8, just removing any possibility of a rook takes bishop sack. And now this was absolutely the key moment in the game. Magnus spent a long time here considering bishop g5. He didn't play it. It's so complicated. Now let me just give you a couple of possible lines. So if pawn takes, then rook takes pawn, threatening, of course, queen h4 mate. So the knight has to come preventing that, and also blocks the g-file so that the king can step across. Now, Magnus was looking at lines like this, but he said he couldn't quite see a way through. And it's extraordinary that black can survive this position. If bishop g7, this does look very promising for white. Let's eliminate this bishop. Give a check on d4. And the players agreed afterwards that this looked extremely promising for white after perhaps h4, just opening up the g-file, or they were also looking at knight e2, just sending the next one round, and it does look absolutely terrible for black, considering that this queen can't be shifted. I think that's the key piece in the position. After rook g1, rook c8 is possible. And incredibly, it seems as though black can survive this position. It looks terminal. But the king is actually going to step across and achieve some kind of coordination here. Here's one possible conclusion to the game. So after king e7, white can take the bishop, and this would be a draw by perpetual check. Black's king has to keep defending the queen here, attacked by this queen, and you can see that little dance ends in a draw. King d7, knight b6, and so on. Draw by repetition. But bishop g5 is so complicated. There are so many other lines. I should say that the basic threat here is just to take on h4, or possibly play queen h4 as well, which is why, yeah, black really has to take that. We were looking at this during the game and trying to find a possible defense with bishop g7, but perhaps just dropping the bishop back to f4 seems good for white, but fantastically complicated. And Magnus said that he couldn't really find a way through, so thought that sacking another piece was just too risky, because he just didn't find a win. So instead he played bishop g3. And after rook c8, then he played bishop f4. So he's got this bishop onto this diagonal, but basically with two moves instead of the one move with bishop g5 that he really wanted to play but couldn't be sure about it. And here I was thinking rook takes knight seemed attractive, but actually this counterattack goes nowhere, because after knight c4 there's bishop c1 threatening the queen, and also threatening queen f5 and mate. And if queen takes pawn, then a cool move, bishop d2. As well as attacking the queen, it actually prevents queen b4 check. And in this position, e7 is fantastically strong after this and queen f5, and that's actually leading to checkmate. So this position, bishop f4 just played, with threats of bishop h6 or possibly queen h4. Therefore, queen e7 from Peter Svidler covers the h4 square. Now, at this moment, Magnus could see nothing better than to recapture his piece. But really, his initiative is dying here, and this knight is superbly placed on e5, backed up by the bishop, and white has to be extremely careful here. So queen g3, rook g8, necessary, because of course bishop takes knight and queen g6 was threatened. The queen moved back, and rook f8, and the players repeated the position. Well, by this stage, Magnus has nothing better. The only question is whether Peter Svidler can play play on in this position, but in fact, after knight c4, he said that he couldn't really see a clear way forward. In fact, after this, white does seem to have found some harmony in his position. And, well, as Peter said afterwards, this can still go very badly wrong for black. So, a draw. Fantastic game. Such an interesting position. And it just shows the aggressive intent of Magnus in this game. Going for this knight f5 sacrifice. Very entertaining to watch, very entertaining to commentate on as well. So after 3 rounds, 2 players share the lead. Magnus Carlsen has 2.5, and Shahriar Mamedyarov defeated Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. So Mamedyarov also has 2.5 points. So Carlsen and Mamedyarov share the lead after 3 rounds. Do like, comment, and share. And yeah, it'd be interesting to see your reactions to how Magnus is playing. See you soon.